In 1865, news stories did not travel as quickly as they do today. There were no televisions or telephones or even radios. There were newspapers, but the news stories could be about things that happened days or even weeks before. There were also telegraphs, which were short, typed messages that required special skills to read. It could take several days for news to reach soldiers who were miles away from a town or city with a telegraph wire. It could also take days or even weeks for news to reach their families. In tiny towns all over America, parents, wives, and children of soldiers were waiting for a son, husband, or father to return home from the war. So on April 9th, 1865, it took a little while for the news to spread that in a small farmhouse in the village of Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, Robert E. Lee surrendered the remainder of his Confederate army. Within days, most other Confederate armies that had been fighting in other parts of the country surrendered as well. The rebel soldiers laid down their weapons, made oaths to give up the rebellion and never fight against the United States again, and walked home. The Union soldiers were relieved. At last, the long Civil War was ended and the North had won. It was time to return home, rest, and rebuild the nation. It had taken 4 long years, but the United States was on its way to being united again. For the most part, the cities of the North had not been damaged. With the end of the war, Northerners started to think about how to make the country bigger. They focused on building more railroads and spreading westward across the Mississippi River through Missouri and Kansas, over the Rocky Mountains, and all the way to California. For people in the North, life would finally start getting back to normal. They were glad to have something to make in their factories other than weapons and uniforms for war. Most of the battles had been fought in the South. Southerners were relieved that the war was over as well, even if the Confederacy had lost the war. At least there was no more fighting. Nearly all the towns and cities were now ruined and burned, smashed by cannonballs and ransacked or searched through by armies in search of food. Farmlands, roads, railroad tracks, and bridges had been destroyed as well. Times were hardest by far in the South after the war. The U.S. government sent money and supplies as well as soldiers to keep order and start rebuilding towns and cities. This was called Reconstruction because they were rebuilding or reconstructing the South. But it would take many years before there would be true peace, prosperity, and equality in the South. Prosperity is wealth or good fortune. Equality is fairness. For millions of enslaved African Americans in the South, all of this destruction not only meant the end of the war, it meant freedom from a life of slavery. The enslaved Africans were now free people. They could not be forced to work on plantations anymore. They could not be sent away from their families anymore. They were free from slavery and ready to start their lives over again. Remember earlier, you heard that it took some time for news to travel? Well, it took 2 months for the news that the war had ended to reach African Americans in the state of Texas. The Union soldiers arrived in Galveston, Texas on June 19th, 1865 to announce the end of the war and the abolition of slavery. When the African American people in Galveston heard the news, they immediately began to celebrate with prayer, feasting, music, and dancing. Today, Juneteenth is a holiday tradition celebrated annually on June 19th in many states across the country. It is the oldest known celebration recognizing the end of slavery. Many African Americans freed from slavery wanted to get as far away from the South as possible. Some moved north to cities like Philadelphia, Chicago, Detroit, New York, and Washington, D.C. Many arrived with no possessions and no money, nothing but the clothing on their backs and hope for a better life. They worked in factories, built new businesses, and created new neighborhoods, schools, and communities. However, African Americans still faced some of the toughest challenges of all: for although they were free, they did not have all the same rights as white Americans in the North or the South. The end of the Civil War was the beginning of a new age in America. There were still hard times ahead as well as sadness, but the country was unified as a single nation. The Civil War produced many heroes, including one of the most famous Americans of all, Abraham Lincoln. His face appears today on the penny and the $5 bill. There are thousands of towns, buildings, roads, bridges, tunnels, such as the Lincoln Tunnel in New York, and people named after him. In Washington, D.C., there is a giant monument honoring him called the Lincoln Memorial. A monument is a structure built in memory of someone or something. 100 years after the Civil War, an African American named Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and gave the very famous "I Have a Dream" speech. 100 years after the end of slavery, Dr. King and other African Americans continued to work and struggle for fair treatment and equal rights. Throughout the Civil War, Harriet Tubman continued risking her life to free enslaved people and end slavery. During some battles, she also worked as a nurse and sometimes as a spy for the Union Army. Because Harriet Tubman knew the roads and secret trails all around Maryland, Pennsylvania, and elsewhere, she was able to spy on the Confederate Army, telling Union generals in which direction the army was going and how many men they had. After the war, Harriet Tubman moved to Washington, D.C., where she helped the thousands of newly freed African Americans find jobs and homes and begin their lives anew. She also worked for women's rights. During the time of the Civil War, women, black and white alike, were not allowed to vote. That was one of the many important changes America still had to make in order for all of its citizens to be truly free. Ulysses S. Grant was a hero throughout the North. He went on to become President of the United States in 1869. His old rival, Robert E. Lee, moved back to his farm in Virginia, but he was never the same again. A rival is a person you compete against. He died 5 years later, sad and regretful, haunted by all the things he could have or should have done differently during the war, but was still proud to have fought for Virginia. In many parts of America, people were eager to move on into the future. The war had brought about a few positive changes besides freeing the African Americans and keeping the country together. The North had developed new railroad lines to help deliver war supplies. Companies were eager to expand those railroads, especially those in the West. Within a few years, there were new railroads crisscrossing the country, from New York to California and back again. Telegraph wires had expanded as well, so it became possible for a person in New York and a person in California to communicate, share news, and conduct business without waiting weeks for a letter to be delivered by train or on horseback. In northern factories and schools, the Civil War had encouraged a new generation of inventors and scientists. Now that the war was over, those inventors could think about new ways to help people instead of thinking of ways to win the war. They invented new trains, new telegraphs, and new machines of all sorts. Doctors had discovered new types of medicine and new ways to treat injuries and diseases. The Civil War changed the United States in many ways. Hundreds of thousands of men were dead, millions were badly wounded. At the same time, the nation was once again one nation, and millions of former enslaved African Americans were now free. Many fought for this freedom, including many African Americans. Now all Americans were working toward a better, brighter future.